Who was the violinist Ferdinand David? Ferdinand Ernst Victor Karl David was a German virtuoso violinist, composer and conductor. He was born on the 19th of June 1810 and died on the 18th of July 1873. He was raised Jewish, but like many secular Jews of this time period in Germany, converted to Christianity in 1828. Usually this was to be more accepted by the Germans and similar to Mendelssohn's family. Speaking of Mendelssohn, David was born in the same exact house in Hamburg where Felix Mendelssohn had been born the previous year. So he was 1 year younger than Felix Mendelssohn, around 11 months to be precise. At that time, Mendelssohn's father was a leading Hamburg banker, and David's was a prominent merchant or salesman. So the house at Grosse Michaelstrasse 14 was a prodigious nursery. Fanny and Rebecca Mendelssohn were born there as well, as was David's gifted sister Louise, who as Madame Louise Duncan would later have a notable pianistic career in England. What principal teachers did Ferdinand David have? When he was 12 years old, his musical studies took him to Kassel, where for 2 years he studied violin with Louis Spohr and learned music theory from Moritz Hauptmann. This was from 1823 to 1824, and in 1826 he became a violinist at Königstädtisches Theater in Berlin. In 1825, he and his sister, Kabala und Liebe, as their father called them after Schiller's drama, set out on an extended concert tour appearing in Copenhagen, Berlin, Dresden and Leipzig. In Berlin, they renewed their association with the Mendelssohn family, and Ferdinand and Felix became friends. The following year, on Felix's advice, David settled in Berlin, where for 2 seasons he occupied a position in the Königstadt Theater Orchestra. During his Berlin years, David became a regular guest and chamber music partner at Leipziger Strasse 3. In 1829, he was the first violinist of the string quartet of Baron Karl Gotthard von Lipphardt, a German nobleman and father of Karl Eduard von Lipphardt, in Dorpat, which is currently in Tartu, Estonia, but at the time had a very large German-speaking population. Now, Lipphardt was a man of deep culture, an art historian and musical amateur. His collection of paintings, drawings, graphic arts and sculpture, as well as his library of some 30,000 volumes, was preeminent in the Baltic lands. Much of the collection was continued by his son, but was the museum where this was housed, it was sadly destroyed in World War II. Coming back to Ferdinand David, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, he toured as a virtuoso, appearing as far afield as Riga, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in 1835 he became a Concertmeister at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig, working with Mendelssohn. This was a very interesting time to be based in Leipzig, because of course this was where Mendelssohn rediscovered the works of Bach in 1829. I believe they'd been largely forgotten for about 100 years. But then Mendelssohn helped to rediscover, and it's interesting that Ferdinand David was on the scene around that time. Felix Mendelssohn is credited with rediscovering the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, particularly his St. Matthew Passion in 1829. David returned to Dorpat to marry Lipphardt's sister Sophie. His marriage brought with it a considerable fortune. In 1835, David was named concertmaster of the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig, where Mendelssohn had just become conductor. In 1843, David became the first professor of Violinlehrer, at the newly founded Leipziger Konservatorium für Musik. David worked closely with Mendelssohn, providing technical advice during the preparation of the latter's violin concerto in E minor. He was also the soloist in the premiere of the work in 1845. And with Clara Schumann, he played the official premiere of Schumann's first violin sonata in Leipzig in March 1852, the Violin Sonata No. 1 in A minor, Opus 105 by Schumann. Whereabouts did the David husband and wife family live in Leipzig? Well, they took up residence at Gerhard's Garden, No. 12, in a house that Chorley called the Beau Ideal of a German musician's residence. At that time, Leipzig's inner city, which is a mere 1,400 paces across at its largest diameter, was encircled by green space, with alleys, meadows and large elegant gardens, to which Leipzigers could escape in summer months for leisurely strolls, meals, outdoor concerts and theatre performances. So an artistic part of the town, you could say. Ferdinand David would loan money to Robert Schumann and testify on his behalf during Schumann's trial against Friedrich Wieck. David later asked Schumann for pieces for violin and piano, and the sonatas Opus 105 and Opus 121 are dedicated to him. In February 1840, he gave the first performance of Bach's Chaconne with Mendelssohn's piano accompaniment. After Mendelssohn's sudden death, David was assigned Kapellmeister of the Gewandhaus Orchestra, a duty he fulfilled between 1841 and 1842, and then again in 1852 to 1854. After Mendelssohn's death, David was invited to serve as one of the editors of his manuscripts. As time went by, David became more active as a conductor, finding violin playing difficult due to various nervous complaints, while chest ailments sometimes made it difficult for him to breathe. He died suddenly in 1873, aged 63, while on a mountain excursion with his children near Klosters in the Graubünden-Grison area of Switzerland. Many of the compositions of Ferdinand David are for violin, but by no means all. One of his most familiar pieces is the early concertino for trombone and orchestra, Opus 4 of 1838, which continues to be used in university exams for trombone players. And I understand this is actually his most played piece, a trombone piece, not a violin piece. David wrote some 50 published works, many of which are little played today, sadly. However, his cadenza for Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D major, Opus 61, was played by the 12-year-old Joseph Joachim in 1844 and continues to be used. His violin and piano arrangement of Paganini's 24 Caprices for violin and orchestra has also been recorded several times. In later life, he edited performing versions of many works, including Bach's unaccompanied sonatas and partitas for solo violin. David's own compositions number about 50 opuses and include 12 theme and variation pieces for violin and orchestra, 5 violin concertos, a string sextet, concertinos for violin, bassoon, clarinet, trombone and orchestra, and a number of lieder. Supposedly he also wrote 2 symphonies and an opera, but these seem not to have been preserved. David was busy working on many arrangements as well. He had close connections with Breitkopf and Hertel and other publishers in Leipzig, and also worked as editor of violin works, including those of Francesco Maria Veracini, Pietro Locatelli and Johann Gottlieb Goldberg. He was editor of the complete Beethoven piano trios for C.F. Peters' edition. He was also editor of the set of J.S. Bach's sonatas and partitas for solo violin in 1843. I think I have the Carl Flesch edition, so maybe one day I'll get round to comparing my edition with the David edition. His arrangement for violin and piano of Niccolo Paganini's 24 Caprices for solo violin was actually the version used for the world premiere integral recording of the Caprices by Ossi Renardi and Walter Robert in 1940. The Chaconne in G minor, attributed to Tommaso Antonio Vitali, was published for the first time from a manuscript in the Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Dresden, in David's well-renowned violin method, Die Hohe Schule des Violinspiels of 1867. He also wrote an often used version of the cadenza for Beethoven's violin concerto. His cadenza for Beethoven's violin concerto was used by the 12-year-old Joseph Joachim at the revival concert of this piece in 1844 under Mendelssohn. As of the mid-2020s, some 25 of his works have been recorded, notably 2 of his 5 violin concertos by violinist Haggai Shaham. In conclusion then, Ferdinand David was a key figure in 19th century German musical life, who gave the world premiere of Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, Opus 64, one of the most played violin concertos today. After Mendelssohn, Ferdinand Victor David was the unquestioned leader of Leipzig's musical community. Described as a genial, energetic man beloved by the Leipzig public, the acclaimed concertmeister of the Gewandhaus Orchestra was Mendelssohn's close friend and confederate. They had been born under the same roof 11 months apart. Felix on February 3rd, 1809, and Ferdinand on June 16th, 1810. David was appointed as a teacher at the newly opened Leipzig Conservatory, training among others Joseph Joachim and Wilhelm Joseph von Wasilewski. To summarise his career, he was a soloist, conductor, concertmaster, quartet player, composer, editor, and teacher. Alfred Richter, who knew him well, left this vivid portrait. David was not a virtuoso of the highest rank. His left-hand technique was not sufficient for conquering the greatest difficulties. Instead, he possessed an exquisite agility of the right hand to an extent that one encountered in no other violinist, Wieniawski excepted, which however also tempted him into all sorts of tricks, as his violinistic opponents, allegedly also Joachim, deemed them. As concertmaster, David was a man complete in his subject, the right man at the right time in the right place. David became one of the most notable violinists of his time. His playing was said to combine the emotional qualities of Spohr with the increased brilliance and technical skill of his contemporaries. Virtuosity aside, David was almost universally esteemed as a composer. Let's take a look at the violins that he owned.